franchise. In VeggieTales, fruit and vegetables are the characters who retell Christian stories from the Bible. It teaches biblical and Christian values for children. Anyway, in their retelling of the story of Esther, the queen is told that her husband wants her to make him a sandwich at 2 a.m. She, as well as my wife, would do the same thing. Wouldn't you, honey? Would you get up at 2 o'clock and make me a sandwich? You would? Well, she's lying, but anyway, she refuses and suggests that he make his own sandwich, and so for her disobedience, she is kicked down the stairs. I'm surprised so many people know about VeggieTales. Okay, I thought I was the only old person around that knew that, but okay, well. Now, there were 7 wise men who were advisors, that they were closest to the king. They were the only people in the entire kingdom who were allowed to enter the king's presence uninvited and unannounced. We're told that they understood the times. In other words, they used astrology and other forms of divination to determine the correct course of action. And so it was customary for Xerxes to consult these men in matters of law and justice. Now, why he consulted them for a domestic dispute is anybody's guess. I doubt that there was legal precedent on the books for this one. Let me get you all a set of notes here. I think we've got room over here and up. We might split you up here, but it was customary for Xerxes to consult these men in matters of law and justice, but why he did this for a family dispute, I don't know. I don't think there was a legal precedent on the books for something like this. Now, this is kind of interesting, and it may shock you to know that, well, of course it might not shock us, because actually Ronald Reagan made decisions based on astrology. Nancy Reagan's astrologer, as you know. So, but it was standard practice for Persian kings to make important decisions while drunk. Now, when I was in college, I never made an important decision unless I was really, had a snootful. That's when you're in college, right? But when you're a king, that's probably not a good decision. However, unlike what we see here in Esther chapter 1, kings would usually reconsider the decisions the next day when they were more sober. Have you ever, I'm not going to ask, I think everybody's Christian here, but there may have been people like me that maybe were not Christians when you were younger. But is there anybody here who ever maybe drank a little? Did anybody drink at all? Okay, I'm the only one. Okay.
No, Bob.
Anyway, did anybody ever make a decision while you were maybe under the influence that you regretted later?
Only
you, Bob. Of course not. I'm the only one. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I just want to know where I stand here. Okay, according to Herodotus, you remember Herodotus was the the Greek historian. He said any decision that Persians made when they are drunk is reconsidered afterwards when they are sober. And that's always a good policy, I think. Now, although Xerxes invites the council of his 7 advisors concerning what to do with Vashti, what he gets is really more than he bargained for. Because one of the 7 advisors, Memucan, takes what Vashti did very personally. He sees it not only as an affront to Xerxes' authority, he sees it as a national threat. Okay? He sees it as a national threat. And he uses the incident to manipulate the king to his own ends. Now, I'm going to tell you how he does that in a minute here, but Haman, later in the book, is later going to do the same thing with respect to the Jews. Apparently, and we just get this picture of Xerxes, don't we? Xerxes was such a weak leader that he could be easily manipulated. I mean, that's the picture that I get of Xerxes. You know, he's not a strong man. Did you need those? All right. Now, Memucan says that Vashti will have such an influence on the women of the empire that when they hear of the disobedience of Vashti, they're going to do the same thing to their husbands. So it's going to be open season on husbands. Starting with the 7 wives of the king's advisors, which I think anybody here would say that that's overkill, right? Therefore, the king must make sure that the women of the kingdom hear that Vashti has been deposed because of her insolence. And so when they see that what harsh consequences follow disobedience, so the thinking goes, they will be intimidated into respecting their husbands. Now, those of you who are married, how many of you are able to intimidate your wives into respecting you? I don't believe Carrie would do that in a second. Okay, well, I'm going to tell her. Oh. Anyway, one writer, Adele Berlin, she taught Hebrew at the University of Maryland, where I was a student, sees the story of Esther as burlesque. She says it is an artistic composition that for the sake of laughter vulgarizes lofty material or treats ordinary material with mock dignity. And I think that you may see that if you read the book through in its entirety in one sitting. You really get the flow for that. But anyway, ironically, by accepting Memucan's advice, Xerxes ends up publicizing throughout his entire empire his family problems. And thus ordering throughout the empire what he himself could not accomplish within his own palace. That's irony, isn't it? He can't control his own wife, but he expects everybody else to control theirs. And I don't know about you, but I think had Xerxes been sober, he might have decided to deal with the whole situation privately instead of what we call airing his dirty laundry. And what Xerxes does is he winds up embarrassing himself by his decision. And so Xerxes was counseled to never allow Vashti to enter again the presence of King Xerxes. He was also advised to seek a replacement for her. Now, whoever has Daniel chapter 6, please be ready. But this was to be expressed in an edict from the king that would go out to all the provinces in his realm. The stated policy was that the laws of the Medes and Persians, once established, were unchangeable. We see this policy stated again in the story of Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel 6, verses 8 and 12. Who has that?
So
I do. Oh,
somebody else have it?
Daniel
Daniel 6, 8, and 12?
Yes.
Yeah. You
Okay.
can go ahead and read it if you care.
Don't fight about it.
Now, Your Majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then verse 12. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, Your Majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands. in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed.
Okay, now, if that had happened today, the king would have said, oh, I didn't know it would be Daniel. Okay, my bad. We'll forget about it. But you couldn't do that back then, okay? And so this idea of an unchangeable law was likely to prevent the disgrace of having to admit an error. Did anybody, and I hesitate to ask this, but did anybody ever see the movie Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman? Okay, two people maybe. Faye Dunaway was in it. But anyway, Dustin Hoffman plays Little Big Man, who is a white man who was raised by Cheyenne Indians, and he becomes a scout for General George Armstrong Custer, a person you probably have heard of. Anyway, when they get to the Battle of the Bighorn, Little Big Man, Dustin Hoffman, says, "Don't go down there. You know, there's a whole passel of Indians down there." And he said, "Well, it's not worth reversing a Custer decision." If you know anything about George Armstrong Custer, he was a very arrogant man. And he did not want to reverse himself. And I guess apparently a lot of kings don't want to admit they're wrong. But we husbands know that we are always wrong. Amen? Amen. Now, they didn't want to admit public disgrace or admit an error. And any decision by the king in Persia, and very interestingly enough, would go immediately out by messenger service. One writer calls the communication system of ancient Persia the Persian Pony Express. And this allowed for swift communication throughout the empire, which was vast. Apparently they did not have a very good email system. That's a joke.
They didn't have Twitter either.
They didn't have, Twitter, they didn't have that. I mean, can you imagine, not having Twitter or email or telephone or telegraph? Anyway, it went out by horseback. They didn't have fax or anything, but this was the next best thing, at least for the ancient world. The Greek historian Herodotus again, and one reason that I keep mentioning people like Herodotus and Plutarch is because we really get a lot of insight into how things were back then by reading the ancient Greek and Roman historians. So that's why I keep mentioning Herodotus. But he said, and he wrote, "Now there is nothing mortal that accomplishes a course more swiftly than do these messengers. By the Persians' skillful contrivance, these are stopped neither by snow," does this sound familiar, "nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness from accomplishing their pointed course with all speed." Kind of sounds like the U.S. Post Office, doesn't it?
Used to be.
Gee, I wonder where they got that from. Anyway, now, one question that's left unanswered in the first chapter is this. Okay, what's the question? Anybody have an idea? What happened to Vashti? The opening chapter of Esther features excesses of every kind. The writer talks about the size of Xerxes' empire. He talks about the length of the first banquet, the elaborate setting of the second banquet, the amount of wine imbibed, the overreactions to Vashti's defiance. And by flaunting his material wealth, Xerxes hopes to show how great a man he is. Now, on one level, he succeeds, doesn't he? But he also shows how small a man he is. Because his reaction to this whole incident with Vashti shows us how flawed his character really is. In fact, I think the entire first chapter pokes fun at everything about the Persian Empire and its inept leadership. Xerxes feels a need to impress others with his most prized possession, his wife, overriding protocol. What was the protocol? Wives were not to be present at drinking parties. When things started to get out of hand, the wives would leave the room. And she does not appear because that would have demeaned her in the process. I think it's very clear from this chapter that Xerxes is unable to control his anger. He's unable to manage conflict. And he's also not able to make independent decisions. All of which a good king must be able to do. And he can't do any of it. All right. Unless you have any questions, let's move on to chapter 2. The plan to replace Queen Vashti. Because this chapter focuses on the plan and process by which Esther replaces the deposed queen. It also details the uncovering of the assassination plot to kill Xerxes. We also see yet another picture of Persian excess and exploitation. Royal marriages in the ancient world were normally arranged through family or political connections. For example, again, according to Herodotus, King Darius agreed that his wife should be chosen from 7 noble families. And it was not unheard of for a kingdom-wide search to be undertaken to find additional women to indulge a king's every desire and to entertain and impress guests. Now, you may recall, and whoever has 1 Kings 1, please be ready. You may recall that when King David was really elderly, such a search was made for a beautiful young virgin to meet his needs. Okay, who has that?
When King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers over him. Well, sounds close to home. So his attendants said to him, "Let us look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our lord the king may keep warm." Then they searched throughout Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her.
Okay. And so the same thing was basically done for King Xerxes. Now, while queens had their own living quarters, concubines were neither married to the king nor given the same privileges and duties. They lived in a place called the harem. Now, you may have done some reading about this, but some harems actually housed hundreds of women, like dormitories. Many of them living as virtual widows. They would come in as virgins, and then once they were deflowered, the king would have no more use for them. And so they lived basically as widows. You'll recall, whoever has 1 Kings 11:3, please be ready here, that King Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. It just boggles the mind, doesn't it, guys? Okay, 1 Kings 11:3.
I have that.
Okay.
He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
Yeah, that's what happened with Solomon. These wives led his heart astray. These foreign wives had the foreign gods. But this is just excess to me. Most of us, are very content to have one wife. Okay, so, amen? Amen. All right. I'm not even going to go there. So, the Persian king Darius I had 360 concubines selected for their beauty, in addition to his wife Atosa, whom, as they say, he passionately loved. Right. You know, it'd be like, honey, I'm gonna, you know, I truly love you, I really do, but I just need to have these 300 concubines. Hello, there's a disconnect there, isn't there? She wouldn't tolerate it. Actually, I would be dead, so it wouldn't matter. And many of you would too. So, you know, you can fantasize about this, guys, but don't try to put it into practice, okay? Now, Vashti refused to come to King Xerxes, we're told, in the 3rd year of his reign. That would be 483 BC. Esther was made queen in the 7th year, which would have been 479 BC. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to know that there are 4 years between chapters 1 and 2. So, inquiring minds want to know what happened in those 4 years. Well, we're really not given any indication of how much time has elapsed or what has occurred between the 2 chapters. We're simply told later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, it's a long time, isn't it? He was mad for a long time. During those years, we do know from history that Xerxes fought a disastrous war with the Greeks, which was not only a humiliating defeat for him, but it also depleted the treasuries of the Persian Empire. And another byproduct of this was that he was discredited in the eyes of many of his subjects. Now, Herodotus, again, the Greek historian, describes the life of Xerxes after his defeat as one of sensual overindulgence. He reports that Xerxes even had sex with the wives of some of his officers. Apparently, it's okay to do it with your concubines, but you don't do it with your officers' wives. Now, do you know what actually happened to Xerxes? Anybody know? This kind of led to a lot of resentment. And eventually, he was assassinated in his own bedroom in 465 BC. So, anyway, back to the virgins. This gathering of all the beautiful young virgins from throughout the empire may seem outrageous if we compare it to our 21st century thinking. You know, it almost sounds like a Miss America pageant from the 1950s, doesn't it? You know, attitudes have changed a lot since the 1950s. What was the biggest premium paid for a Miss American contestant back in the 50s? It was which competition? Come on. The swimsuit competition. Yeah. It was most important that a woman look good in a swimsuit. Amen? Guys, amen? Now, it's changed now. What is most important now? Is it the talent component, or is it the interview? I don't know about you, but some of these, they sound a little vacuous, don't they? But anyway, but even by Persian standards, this was not the normal way a queen was chosen. Again, according to Herodotus, Xerxes' father, Darius, took his wives from the 7 noble families of Persia. And sometimes they came from the families of the king's closest advisors. Now, consider this scenario here. I want you to think about this. Who was the driving force behind the banishment of Vashti? Well, who was one of the king's closest advisors? Are you beginning to see someone with an ulterior motive here. I'll give you a line from Hamlet, probably one of the most quoted lines from Hamlet. Does something smell rotten in Denmark? I think it's entirely possible that Memucan was hoping that perhaps Vashti's replacement might be chosen from his family. Do you think? I mean, I'm just throwing that out there, because that would have increased his power and his influence. And now it's interesting, some critics have concluded that since royal wives were only chosen from high-ranking families, then the story of Esther is only a fairy tale, which I don't believe. We talked about that the first day. According to another Greek historian, Plutarch, you may have heard of him. He wrote a very famous work called Plutarch's Lives. He reports that other Persian kings sometimes did marry, contrary to law, women with whom they had fallen in love with. And surely, if you think about it, a king who had absolute power could have married any woman he wanted. Now, you think about the kings of England. Remember a guy named Henry VIII? He's not a guy that you would really like, I don't think. But he found it very convenient. When he got tired of a wife, he would do what?
Cut off their head.
Yeah, cut their heads off, exactly. But he ran up against the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Church of England. And even Henry VIII really couldn't do what he wanted to, although in the end he really did. But let me recall for you a true story from recent history, and I saw a mention of this last night. Unless you've been living in a cave, you know that Queen Elizabeth of England died 2 days ago, right? But this true story from recent history is from 1937. How many of you have heard of Prince Edward, who was Edward VIII? Remember him? He actually abdicated the throne to marry a woman by the name of Wallis Simpson. She was a commoner from Pennsylvania. Not that everybody from Pennsylvania is a commoner, but she was from Pennsylvania and she was a commoner. But even worse than that, scandal of scandals, she was divorced. And so Edward the Eighth, Prince Edward, is the only British sovereign to voluntarily give up his crown. Now, in addition to one or more wives, Persian kings typically had many concubines, women who came as virgins to the king's bed and then lived in luxury and desolation in his harem. It's said that Artaxerxes II had 360 concubines of surpassing beauty in his harem. Herodotus also reports that 500 young boys were gathered each year, every year, and castrated to serve as eunuchs in the Persian court. Now, why do you think they castrated them? Anybody want to venture a thought?
Because of the harem.
Because of the harem, exactly. I don't know about you, but I don't think when I was younger, I could have handled working in a harem. I just don't think I could have handled that. But anyway, they served as eunuchs in the Persian court. Now, we might argue that women got the better deal. But that is the reality of life in the Persian court. Such brutality was typical of how power was used in the Persian court. Anyone, male and female alike, was at the disposal of the king's personal whims. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, that doesn't speak well for David and Solomon either. Because I'm sure it's the same rules.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
I never understood that.
Well, I have a real problem with polygamy and concubines among the kings. I mean, even though that was kind of the going thing back then, and we just finished 1st and 2nd Samuel a while back. You know, man after God's own heart, David having all these concubines. I mean, nobody can have that much sex. I mean, I don't care who you are. I mean, Wilt Chamberlain, you know, I mean, what did he say, 20,000 women? But, I mean, come on. That's excessive. And I have a real problem with that. I really do. Any other comments? Questions? Okay. In verses 5 through 7, we have Mordecai and Esther introduced. Now, Mordecai is introduced in verse 5 as a Jew, which was a term that described all Hebrews in this period. Mordecai was probably not his Hebrew name, but was rather a Babylonian name given to him. Now, you'll recall that this was common practice for Jews in exile. For example, Daniel, he had 3 friends. Remember the 3 friends? Yeah. They were given Babylonian names. Who has Daniel 1, 6, and 7?
Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, when you went in exile, you were given a Babylonian name, and you never used your Hebrew name anymore. And it's interesting, if you read anything about the Indian schools of about a century ago, what did they try to do to the Indian children? They were not allowed to use Indian names or use the Indian language. They wanted to beat the Indian out of the Indian. They wanted them speaking only English. So,
Cut their hair also.
yeah, they cut their hair also. Anyway, Mordecai is introduced as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. We're also told that he was a descendant of a man named Kish. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but if we read verses 5 and 6 on the surface, they would suggest that Mordecai was taken into exile with King Jehoiachin. Now, that happened in 597 BC. Does anybody see the problem here? Well, the problem is that would make Mordecai over 100 years old, which I doubt. I think it's very highly unlikely. One writer attempts to solve the problem, and I think this is probably a good one. This reference need not be taken to mean that Mordecai and Jehoiachin were contemporaries, but rather to indicate the solidarity of God's covenant people. The author's point in mentioning the exile of the king of Judah is to associate Mordecai with the exile out of the promised land and all it connotes, thereby providing a historical context within which to understand the events that are about to transpire, unquote. And I think that's a good way to look at it. It gives us a historical context, not that Mordecai was actually in Jerusalem and then was brought out. I think that Mordecai was probably born in Babylon, most likely. Now, Mordecai is also said to be the son of Shammai, the son of Kish. Now, there was another famous Benjamite whose father's name was Kish, and I know nobody remembers this, but I didn't remember it until I was studying for this, but his name was Saul, King Saul. It's likely that the narrator wants us to understand that Saul's father was an ancient ancestor of Mordecai. Now, if you read carefully verse 6, you'll notice that Mordecai's connection with the exile is mentioned 4 times. Why the repeated mention of the exile? Why is that significant? Well, it provides the only explanation for the Jewish presence in Susa, which was the, Xerxes' capital there. Let me read something to you from, this is an old classic reprint from the 19th century. This was a fellow by the name of Alexander Raleigh. And I'd like to read something from his book here. He says, anyone having prepossession against Mordecai can say, what is he doing there at all? A man of energy and capacity? Why had he not returned to Jerusalem with those, or after them, who had been set free? Patriotism would have carried him to Palestine, condemns him living still in Persia. Now, if you have read the book of Ezra, you know that the Jews were sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And Nehemiah also went back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so even though Mordecai was not born in the Promised Land, if he was a patriotic Jew, if he had anything on the ball, why didn't he go back? What is he doing there in Susa? He also says here about Esther and Mordecai. He says they are colorless people when we first see them. And although they become more pronounced as the drama unfolds itself, they never stand out morally and religiously among the best. So they don't really stand out as people of faith. I think this tells us something about Mordecai, doesn't it? At the beginning of the book of Ezra, we learn that King Cyrus of Persia allowed for any Jew who wanted to do so to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And there were 41,360 Jews who went back to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel, sometime around 530 BC. Now, these were Jews of great faith and connection with the city of Jerusalem. Yet Mordecai stays home. Is it because he was not a man of great religious faith? Well, we'll talk about this later, but yeah.
I guess I'm hesitant judging them because there's a lot of, like even wasn't it Ezra who was a cupbearer for the?
No, that was Nehemiah.
Okay, so Nehemiah was a cupbearer, and so he didn't go back until he got permission.
Yeah, he had to get permission to go back.
So, God uses
Artaxerxes, yeah.
If he's following God's commands, then maybe God told him not to go back because he knew that he was going to be needed here. So
Okay.
I guess.
Got one back here. Well, am I seeming judgmental?
Yeah.
Denny, go ahead.
Maybe he was just born there and had more of a kinship with that piece of dirt and wasn't encouraged to go back. Maybe there were family conditions that compelled him to stay.
Yeah.
He may not have been the patriarch at the time of the return.
Yeah.
And so he stayed with his family.
Yeah. Frankly, I don't think he was a man of great religious faith, personally. Go ahead.
But like she said, and elaborating on that a little bit, I think you have to think about the sovereignty of God. He had the plan.
Yeah.
He has people in places, just as Esther and I think it was Mordecai said, perhaps you are here in this place for this time.
Yeah.
And I think that's more the case.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
Well, but there were a number of quote-unquote Jews who did not return simply because it had been such a separation from what they knew until what they'd learned over the decades. They lived outside of Jerusalem or outside of Israel.
I was really hoping to provoke something here.
I was gonna say, God, Jeremiah had told the people, he said, you're gonna get all wiped out. He said the people that were there left, Nebuchadnezzar was gonna take you, and you're supposed to go, work hard, become part of it, work for Nebuchadnezzar, which I always thought was kind of strange.
Yeah.
and be good citizens and helpers.
Well, of course, keep in mind that Jeremiah was accused of being a traitor.
Well, before.
Before.
that happened.
And nobody liked Jeremiah, by the way. Okay, well, these are all really good comments, and I'm not trying to be judgmental about Mordecai, I'm just trying to raise the question. But personally, I don't really see him as a man of great faith. I see him as just kind of an average Jew, maybe kind of halfway neutral, but God is going to, he's going to be used of God. And God can use anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Denny, go ahead.
If he was average, why was he seated at the gate of the
An
city?
average Jew, I said. Okay, we're going to get to that because yes, he was. He was. He was seated at the gate, which is a position of some prominence. So apparently, some Jews did achieve prominence. Mordecai, Nehemiah, a cupbearer was a great Daniel. These were all, wonderful positions to have. So there were a lot of people that, achieved positions of prominence. And we see this in the United States. We see people in Congress who came over from Cuba, from the Castro regime. And now, they're American citizens, they're serving in Congress. I don't know, are there any governors that you know of? I don't know. But anyway, I think these are all good comments, by the way. Thank you. Esther is introduced by her Hebrew name Hadassah, which means myrtle, and this is the only time that this is going to be mentioned. Her Babylonian name is Esther, likely comes from Ishtar. I don't know if you've heard of Ishtar, but she was the name of the Babylonian goddess of love and war. I remember when I was learning Akkadian, one of the texts that I was translating was the descent of Ishtar, which was a lot of fun. Cuneiform, I don't know if you know anything about that. It's wedge-shaped, it's Akkadian and it's cuneiform. They used to do it in clay. They would make wedge-shaped marks in clay. Email's a lot easier. Anyway, Esther is the only person in the story with two names. One interpreter sees this as the narrator's way of depicting Esther as a young woman trying to live in two worlds. One was the Jewish world in which she was raised, and the other, the opulent world of the Persian court into which she was thrust. By deliberately mentioning both her Hebrew and her Babylonian name, perhaps the writer of Esther was making a point that she was a woman who moved between two worlds, that she was a woman with two identities. And I think this is an issue that's going to come into focus later in the story. She's described as Mordecai's cousin. We're told that she was an orphan and that Mordecai raised her, so I would assume that Mordecai was considerably older than Esther was. Nothing is said about her character at all, or her religion, except that she was beautiful. We're told that her appearance was beautiful. According to rabbinic tradition, and you can probably take this with a grain of salt, Esther was one of the four most beautiful women in the world. The other three being Sarah, Rahab, and my wife Tess. Abigail. Remember Abigail was Naboth's wife, and when he died of a heart attack, David took her as an extra wife. Anyway, Mordecai commands Esther to conceal her nationality and background, her family background. Now, we're not given any rationale for this. Whatever his reasons for doing this, she certainly compromised. She had to have compromised whatever fidelity that she had to the Torah, the law of God. I don't know why he did this. It's possible that he didn't want to diminish her chances for success with Xerxes if he knew that she was a Jew. But I don't really think that that was the reason. Because the only criteria that Xerxes had, apparently, was a woman's performance in the bedroom. Not her ethnicity, not her religious convictions, not whether she was a good conversationalist. He was a sexist through and through. He wanted a woman who was beautiful and who was good in bed. Now, I'm not saying that Xerxes was shallow. Gee, am I implying this?
I'll say it.
But a woman's personality was not part of the equation. Okay? Am I accusing him? You all seem to think I'm judgmental. Okay. We're going to see a woman transformed. Esther begins the story as a compliant young woman who relies on her beauty to get ahead. But along the way, she remakes herself into a powerful leader of the Jews, on whose authority the customs of Purim still stand. In literature, she is what we would call, and I'm an old English teacher, I taught English for 20 years, but she's what we would call a dynamic character. There are two characters in literature, two types of characters. You have a static character who is one that does not change, and then a dynamic character is one who does change. Esther changes radically throughout the course of the book. She changes from a woman of weak character to a woman of heroic moral stature and political skill. And if you read about, the banquets and the way she manipulates Xerxes, she had some political chops. She really did. She probably would have been a better king than Xerxes. We see a similar change in a woman who was also, she was also a woman, but she was not a Jew. But she has become revered by the Jewish people. Tell me if you know who she is. She was an innkeeper in Jericho, which was another name for prostitute. Rahab. Rahab is one of the shining lights in Jewish history, even though she was a Gentile. Now, let's see here. I think I'm going to stop here. Tess has, so we can get to church, but I like to get us out about 5 minutes early. But Tess has an announcement to make. So, and by the way, we welcome those of you who are here just because Jason's class is not